Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
It's no secret that we are all about personal growth here at Personality Hacker. And one of our favorite tools, obviously, is personality psychology. The Myers-Briggs system in particular, we love the system because we feel like it gives people a great understanding of themselves and how to craft a unique personal growth path for themselves by understanding who they are and how they show up to the world. And in the midst of that, we have something that we always reference in these podcasts when we're talking about the system, and that is what we've called the CAR model. If you want a visual reference of this, you can go over to our website, personalityhacker.com, and type into the search field there, CAR model. An article will come up that gives a visual representation of what I'm talking about when I say CAR model. And basically what the CAR model is, it's a way for us to understand the mental wiring of our minds, what's technically called our cognitive function stack in Myers-Briggs terms. And it gives just a really great, easy way to understand how our minds are wired and where these parts of our minds and the mental wiring of our minds are placed in our personality. And it really informs how we show up to the world, and it informs our growth path, and it informs a lot about what we talk about here at Personality Hacker. And the advice we often give over and over again, ad nauseum, we'll give this advice to get into what we've called our Copilot process. Technically, it's called the auxiliary process if you're looking at a traditional cognitive function stack. We feel that getting into that Copilot process and really growing that is a leverage point for your personality. And you've probably heard, if you've been a longtime listener, us talk about this for a long time, that we think that's the greatest leverage point. And often what happens is we don't go there initially as people. We tend to skip over that and go to what's technically called the tertiary process. In the CAR model, we call it your 10-year-old cognitive function process. And sometimes there's some confusion around this. Sometimes it sounds like we might be demonizing that tertiary or 10-year-old process. We might be saying, it's not serving you, don't ever go there, it's not useful, it means you're in a broken state if you're ever relying on this process to show up to the world. And today we want to set the record straight a little bit. We want to talk a little bit about the good aspects of that 10-year-old tertiary process, how it shows up for you in your personality, and how it actually can, in the right way, like if you access it in the right fashion, it can actually accelerate your growth and really support you on a personal growth path.
When people are into personal development and have done a lot of growth, figured out growth strategies that really work for them, regardless of whether or not they're familiar with Myers-Briggs or cognitive functions, oftentimes they will stumble upon something that grows that Copilot process or that auxiliary process. And then they get to a place where they understand or learn about Myers-Briggs and they learn about cognitive functions. And then we'll get people who are new to the system but are not new to personal development saying, well, I don't feel like my 10-year-old process is a weakness, or I don't feel like my tertiary process is bad for me. I actually feel like I've got a good relationship with it. And the reason for that is you probably do have a good relationship with it. If you've been into development and growth for a while and you've been figuring out strategies that you tailored to yourself to expand your growth and become really mature using that Copilot, then oftentimes it is time to give some attention and love to that tertiary process, that 10-year-old tertiary. And in personal development, well, actually, even just in traditional Myers-Briggs, the rule of thumb that I've heard a lot of people say is that we start developing our dominant, or what we call the driver function, when we're when we're young, maybe even in our teens. And then we start really growing and developing our Copilot or the auxiliary process when we're in our 20s, maybe 30s sometimes. And then people will start to flirt with that 10-year-old tertiary process in like their 30s/40s. And then people will start really pursuing or understanding that inferior process, or what we call the 3-year-olds, when they get into like their 50s, maybe. And that's not a bad rule of thumb. That is oftentimes the trajectory of how we become more familiar with this part of who we are. We stop to see it as a weakness. We start to see it as maybe a joy or something that is undiscovered territory. So that's not a bad rule of thumb. But if you're really into development and growth, sometimes you can accelerate that process. Sometimes you can be ready for the 10-year-old tertiary process way earlier because you've spent so much time developing and fleshing out your auxiliary Copilot process. So if you're really into development and growth, then you might be ready to really truly explore that tertiary. And so what we want to talk about today is developing the best relationship with that tertiary process, really understanding ways that it can serve you, not be a hindrance, not be an immature part of you that you have to marginalize or avoid. Because usually what we talk about is people will call it a loop, a cognitive function loop. We call it going to your defensive 10-year-old process here at Personality Hacker. But that loop is very seductive. And the trick of getting out of the loop is to get into the Copilot. We'll explain what the loop is in just a moment. But the trick is generally to get into the Copilot. So almost always the advice is to get out of that 10-year-old and to get into the Copilot. And if you've done that enough, you might be ready to go from the Copilot to the 10-year-old. So let's talk about ways to avoid the loop, talk about ways the loop can show up, and then talk about ways that that tertiary 10-year-old process can be a real help for you. So the first thing we should mention is, what is the loop? Why is it that we oftentimes recommend going to the Copilot process? Now, this is a little technical, and if you haven't heard about this before, you might have to listen to this a couple times. If this is brand new content for you, if you've never heard of cognitive functions. But one of the things we recommend is, if you're new, to use the CAR model as a way to understand some of these. So if you want to, go to personalityhacker.com, and in the search field, put in CAR model, and an article will come up that talks about or explains how these cognitive functions work. But if you're a person who's been listening to us for a while or familiar with cognitive functions, then some of this won't be new content for you. So the way that it works is, if we are an introvert, what defines us as an introvert is that our dominant or driver process is an introverted process. So really what it means is that we're not so much an introvert as we are somebody who highly favors a specific introverted process as our favorite style of interacting with the world. And the same applies if you're an extrovert. It means that that dominant or driver process is an extroverted process or extroverted cognitive function. So like Joel and I are both extroverts, but we might not show up as totally social all the time. And one of the reasons is because we lead with a cognitive function that is technically called extroverted intuition. And our nickname for that is exploration. Well, extroverted intuition has us wanting to explore novelty, find new things, new paths, new connections, seeing the connections between disparate items. And that sometimes means that we're not around anybody when we're engaged in that process. One of the ways that I've exercised my exploration process is by deliberately driving to a place I've never been before and getting lost. Now, I might be all by myself in the car, but I just got lost on purpose, so I'd have to figure my way out. And that's one of the ways that my extroverted process shows up. Now, notice I'm in the external world. I'm driving. I'm doing external world activity. So that's part of how you know. But it doesn't always necessarily mean social. And the same thing with introverts. Somebody who is, say, an INFP or an ISFP that leads with a process called introverted feeling, or what we call authenticity, they'll go into a flow state when they're listening to somebody. And so that introverted process gets activated even though they are actually in the company of somebody else and they're listening to that other person. So even though it's an introverted process, it's getting activated in what could appear to be a social setting. So that's one of the ways that you can suss out what the difference is between introverts and extroverts is, sometimes going to these cognitive functions for reference points. Now, the reason why I mention that is one of the ways that our Copilot or auxiliary process serves us is that process is automatically going to be what's technically called the opposite attitude. But just think of it as like sort of the opposite inner or outer world frame from the dominant or driver process. So that means if I'm an extrovert, my dominant process or driver process will be extroverted, but that Copilot or auxiliary process will have to be introverted. The reason why it has to be introverted is that's part of how it serves me. It gives me access to a different world. It helps flesh me out. It helps me engage with the world that my dominant process doesn't allow me to engage with, which is that internal world. One of the reasons why we're always harping on going to the Copilot is because the Copilot helps balance us out. It helps get access to things that we might otherwise ignore or neglect. Now, the tertiary or 10-year-old process is the opposite of the Copilot process. So it's going to go back to that same attitude that the dominant or driver process has, which means that if I'm an extrovert, I'm leading, or my dominant process is extroverted, my Copilot or auxiliary process is introverted, but my 10-year-old or tertiary process goes back to being extroverted. All right. And the reason why we get caught in a loop is that we are preferring the attitude or the world of our dominant process, and we're not seeking balance or added wisdom from the Copilot or auxiliary process to the other attitude or world. So when I get caught in a loop, I get caught in a loop of extraversion. When an introvert gets caught in a loop, they get caught in a loop of introversion. It's going to look different depending upon your personality, because every personality type has a different cognitive function stack or mental processes that occupy those seats in the car. But the pattern is the same. The pattern is that we are going to get caught in a loop that keeps us in the world that we favor. If I'm an extrovert, that means I'm going to get caught in a loop that favors the extroverted world. If I'm an introvert, I get caught in a loop that favors the introverted world. When we have done a lot of personal development work, that means that we have instinctively on some level understood this need is going unmet to go into that other world. So even if we don't know Myers-Briggs or cognitive functions, or have never heard of our cognitive function stack, we will instinctively gravitate towards strategies and exercises and, different basically personal development routines, habits, lifestyle choices that help meet that need of going to the other world. So let's say we're now balanced. Let's say I'm an ENTP and I'm leading with an extroverted process and supplementing it with an introverted process. And I've done a lot of work on that introverted process. And I'm making sure that I'm staying in that Copilot process. For me, it's as an ENTP, it's introverted thinking. If I'm not caught in a loop, if I'm not caught in that loop of extroversion and I'm fleshing out who I am by making sure to access that introverted process, how does the 10-year-old process serve me? How can I utilize my tertiary 10-year-old process that goes back to being extroverted? How can I utilize that in my life to be an added tool to the basket, not a detriment?
Yeah, if it's 10-year-old, you don't want to put a 10-year-old in charge of anything. You don't want a 10-year-old running the show. I mean, you don't allow any 10-year-old in your life to make the decisions or show up for you in any kind of responsible, significant way. At least I hope you don't. If you're a mature adult, you don't let 10-year-olds show up for you in life in any kind of responsible way. Typically, 10-year-olds are in support of what you're doing. So if you have children, for example, and you're going on a picnic, you might give your 10-year-old a small project, maybe carrying some of the drinks or helping set the table or something, but you're not going to put a 10-year-old in charge of the entire picnic without supervision. And yet that's what we seem to do in our personalities. We tend to, when we skip past that Copilot and we get to that 10-year-old process, it's like giving the wheel to a 10-year-old or giving the responsibility to a 10-year-old. And they freak out. Our little personality 10-year-old goes, oh my gosh, don't give this to me. I can't handle this. And often they'll make 10-year-old style decisions or look at the world as a 10-year-old would look at the world. And that can be problematic. So we continue harping on getting into that Copilot. And yet 10-year-olds aren't idiots. They're not dumb. They're not completely unable to do anything in the world. They can show up in a supportive way. And there's a burgeoning maturity that comes with 10-year-olds in the real world. And again, this is all metaphor. This is all how to see it, basically. But that part of your personality, like Antonia just said, can serve you in a lot of healthy ways for that Copilot process. Once you have gone and worked on that, that can be a very supportive place in your personality. And it's actually really exciting when you get to that place, because I think it shows up and it adds things to you and your life that really start to kick in high gear on your personal growth journey, personal growth path.
Right. So one of the ways that it could be illustrated in how we go to the 10-year-old process in an unhealthy way is oftentimes we call that 10-year-old or tertiary process our defensive position. When we get caught in a loop and we're skipping the Copilot auxiliary, generally we're doing that because our dominant or driver process wants to stick with or cling to or not see anything outside of an assumption it's made or a comfort zone it's in or whatever it is that the dominant process is clinging to. It wants to stay there. It doesn't want the Copilot to give it an alternative perspective. It doesn't want another adult to show up to the party and go, well, have you thought about this maybe? Like, it doesn't want any of that. That's uncomfortable. That gets it out of its comfort zone, or it forces it to see a reality it doesn't want to see. And so what the tertiary defensive position will do is it will it will be like an echo chamber for that dominant or driver process. It'll go, yeah, you're totally right. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no. Let me find all the reasons why your assumption or the result of your thinking or whatever it is totally right, and you don't need to think anything else. So the tertiary 10-year-old shows up in a defensive way, not like necessarily argumentatively defensive, but more like you're trying to defend yourself from a message the universe is trying to give you. The universe is trying to tell you something and you're just not wanting it, like you're not having any of it. And so you'll use that tertiary 10-year-old process to help defend against that information.
Or defend something that you've assumed is correct. Defend against something you've basically adopted as, well, this is truth, this is reality, this is whatever it is. You're like using that as a way to give argument for that. And that's defending what you already believe in a sense.
And you could see a 10-year-old coming in really handy for that. Like if you have a 10-year-old child and you complain about something, that 10-year-old is probably not going to give you a lot of dissenting opinions and like, well, mom, did you think about this? Maybe they're coming from this perspective. I mean, like the unique 10-year-old might do that, but most 10-year-olds are going to be like, yeah, that person's bad. They made you mad. That person's a bad person for making you mad. And the 10-year-old's going to be just swooping in to give you added fuel to defensiveness. But a good friend can be used that way. A good friend can be used to defend against whatever you want to believe. And in that way, we call it doing the Yoko Ono, like Yokoing, which is, like in a situation where you're unhappy with something and you come home and they didn't see the whole situation get flushed out. They only hear what you have to say, which is biased and based on your negative opinions. Let's say that that you go to work and you have maybe like a trouble with your boss, or you have people on your team that you're not really fans of, and your spouse at home is not seeing your relationship with this team. They're not seeing all the ways in which maybe you're creating a bad dynamic, or how maybe things are actually fair towards you, but you just can't see it yet. All they hear is all the injustices you're bringing home to them. Can you believe this person said this to me? Or, can you believe that my boss said this? And so because they want to support you, and because they aren't actually seeing the whole situation, they'll rush to your defense and also encourage you to do things like quit, right? Like they're like, oh, they can't treat you like that. You should go quit, right? And that's part of creating that defensive echo chamber. We call it doing the Yoko. And so one of the ways that the 10-year-old shows up is by being your ultimate Yoko.
Let's look at a real-world example of this, a hypothetical real-world example of this. Let's assume you're an INTJ in a relationship. And that means that you would lead with a process that we've nicknamed perspectives, technically called introverted intuition. And your 10-year-old process would be a process, introverted feeling. We've nicknamed it authenticity. It's about how you feel internally, how you're in touch with your internal emotions and how you feel. Let's say you're in a relationship and things aren't going well. And that 10-year-old pops up for you and says, things aren't going well. I feel like this relationship is doomed. I feel like we probably need to get out of this relationship. It's not going well for us. And it feels a heightened sense of exaggerated, like negative emotion around it. It just feels awful. Our recommendation for you in a normal situation, and in all situations, would be get into that Copilot and evaluate your relationship instead of using that 10-year-old to rely upon a big decision with the relationship. Maybe sit down and for you as an INTJ, if you are an INTJ, as an example, your Copilot would be extroverted thinking. We've nicknamed it effectiveness. It's about what works, about data points, about measurement, about what's actually happening. So you would sit down and make maybe a pro and a con list about the relationship. What are the pros of this relationship? What are the cons of this relationship? And you get some kind of working like 80-20 metric around it.
Yeah, well, or you can look at the system of the relationship. What is the dynamic? How are you actually helping create the dynamic that is, something that is unacceptable to you? And is there any way that you can systemically encourage the relationship to go on a different track? Like, is there anything in maybe even the ecology? Is it like we're fighting over money all the time? Or, like maybe there's a mother-in-law or father-in-law involved or whatever. So like you look at it in terms of systems as opposed to simply like I'm getting my feelings hurt a lot.
Yeah, you somehow get it extroverted outside of yourself, create a metric around it, create the situation of what's actually happening. Now you have something to work with. You have something to look at and go, wait a minute, 20% of the time or 25% of the time, I'm getting triggered around these three things. Those are fixable things in my relationship. My 10-year-old's telling me that this is completely unfixable. It's blowing it all out of proportions, exaggerating how I feel about it. But when I look really at what's happening, this is something we could work on. I could talk to my partner and we could fix these things and work on these things together. And then it calms down that 10-year-old part of you that's all worked up into a frenzy and feeling like you just got to cut and run from this relationship because it's not working out. You've put it in its place. It's a 10-year-old that got really emotional maybe, and you gave it something. You gave an adult that came in and said, hold on a minute, don't get so emotional. Here's the facts. Now, that's just an example for an INTJ as an example. You could do this with all the personality types in a similar fashion. If you work through a hypothetical situation, how we advise you not to get to your 10-year-old and in fact get to your Copilot instead.
Right. But let's say you are going to your Copilot. Let's say you are looking at it in using the lenses of your best and highest self. Now, how does the tertiary or the 10-year-old show up? Well, it's not going away, right? Like, it's not like you put it in its place and maybe locked it in a closet and now you no longer listen to it. It's still there, but now it's no longer like you're not stuck in a loop of it simply being the Yoko, right? Like, it's not just trying to support whatever is the dominant processes, you know, it's hypotheticals or whatever it wants to believe or whatever it thinks is happening. Now, instead of being a Yoko, now instead of being like a defensive position, now it can be like you mentioned, Joel, earlier. When you go to the picnic, the 10-year-old can be supportive. It's not going to run the picnic, but it can say maybe set up the table or make sure that the younger kids are, you know, like showing up when it's dinner time or whatever. And your 10-year-old process can be a support for you as well. In the scenario you're talking about with the INTJ that is in a relationship and is trying to figure out, how do I make sure that, you know, like I'm looking at the system of the relationship and trying to figure out where I can maybe do better or implement a strategy that will make everybody feel better. I notice that this person is, maybe my spouse is not feeling safe, and maybe I can implement some strategies to make them feel safer. One of the ways that your tertiary or 10-year-old can show up in that situation is by giving you access to a very sympathetic part of who you are. Introverted feeling at its very base level is about how things are making me feel. But because it understands how things are making you feel, it helps you understand how things generally make people feel. And so when you really work on introverted feeling or start to kind of focus on how this impacts you and, and the ways in which it can show up in a healthy way, you'll start noticing how you actually can be quite sympathetic to other people's plights. So it's not just about now implementing the system to ensure that the other person feels safe. Now it allows you to be soft about the situation as well. How do I implement these systems in a way that really is going to touch the other person? How can I not just create a system of safety, maybe like get our finances in order so that everybody feels good about it and we're not fighting about money anymore, but also check in and go, hey, are you feeling okay? You feeling good? I really want this to work out. I would really love to make it so that, you know, we implement the systems or we do the things that we need to do. And also, I just really want to make sure that you know that I care about your feelings. I want you to know that it's important to me to make you feel good. And so now it's implementing the strategy with a component that supports everything. It's helping you get the task done in a better way. And for an INTJ, it would be in a more effective strategy. It's more effective not to just implement strategies, but to implement them in a way where they're taking the individuals involved into consideration. So when we have a good, healthy relationship with our 10-year-old tertiary process, we find that it helps support us and fleshes us out by giving us extra tools that we wouldn't necessarily have access to. Let's use another example. Let's use you as, well, actually, let's use me because your Copilot and 10-year-old are the same as an INTJ's, only in reverse. They're also extroverted thinking and introverted feeling, only in opposite positions. Let's take me as an ENTP because I have different Copilot and tertiary, or Copilot auxiliary and 10-year-old tertiary. As an ENTP, like I mentioned, my dominant cognitive function or my driver process is extroverted intuition, what we call exploration. And my Copilot or auxiliary is introverted thinking. We also call this accuracy. And my 10-year-old is extroverted feeling, or what we call harmony. Now, the way that I get caught in a loop is that I'll bypass introverted thinking or accuracy, or the thing that helps me be rational and cool and a little emotionally disconnected in order to help problem solve a situation. I skip that and my loop goes straight to extroverted feeling, which is about emotional expressiveness and understanding how we're all interconnected. But at a 10-year-old level, it can be quite disconcerting because I never quite know how I'm showing up. Am I connected with other people? Am I doing the socially appropriate thing? And then my agitation and anxiety will lead me to be emotionally expressive in a negative way. I'll get really angry, I'll explode at people, or I'll just have a meltdown. That's my loop. My loop leads me to a place where I'm kind of an emotional basket case. So what going to my Copilot does is it helps me get really rational. It helps me get very analytical. It gives me some emotional distance so that I can figure out what's actually going on in a situation. And then when I realize or I have clarity around what's happening, and when I realize what the data points actually are, this is actually what's going on, this is what's happening, this is how it all fleshes out, and here's the truth that needs to be revealed. I almost always discover that as an ENTP, my job in a situation is to bring clarity to what's going on, to speak some truths that maybe aren't clear to other people. One of the ways my 10-year-old shows up for me in those situations, though, is to be able to communicate those truths in a way that is palatable to others. Because if my introverted thinking just showed up and started speaking truths to other people, I would probably say it in just about the worst way possible. You know that phrase, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care? What my extroverted feeling or harmony process does is it helps me communicate to others how much I care. So then they care how much I know. And all of a sudden now I'm delivering a truth that needs to be delivered, and I'm doing it in a package where people go, you're right. Or maybe, I'm not sure if I agree with you, but I appreciate where you're coming from. And all of us have that. All of us have the ability to go to our 10-year-old or tertiary to flesh out our messages, or maybe just get us in a space where we are more effective at what we're attempting to accomplish.
So let's take two more examples just to flesh it out. Let's try to get a little more rounded on some other personality types. Just as an example for you to get a pattern here, and you can connect the dots for your personality if you're one of the different personalities from these. Let's take an ISTP personality. We have a relative of ours who is a police officer, and we were talking to him about how he goes through his police work, how he shows up as an ISTP in the force, and how he knows if someone's lying to him, how he knows kind of criminal behaviors, and how he's making judgments in real time what people might do and how his safety and other people's safety might be at risk.
Well, and to give some context, he was actually a drug enforcement officer.
Yes.
And so he would go do drug busts undercover. So he would go buy drugs from people in mass in huge quantities. And he would end up at these houses, which were pretty shady. And he would have to be he'd have to be prepared and ready for anything to go down.
Yeah, and sometimes it did. Sometimes he got himself in some pretty crazy situations. Some of his stories are very fascinating. He kept us captivated for hours telling us stories. And what we looked at, what he was doing, he really articulated to us this notion of he shows up best when he's present with the drug dealer, looking at them, seeing what they look like, watching their body language, and understanding how they're physically showing up, what the words they're saying. And then he's able from that, and I'll unpack what this all means in a second, but from that, he's able to understand what they might be capable of doing. And he can anticipate some of their behaviors based on what he's seeing in the moment.
And you run simulations of all the things that could go wrong.
Yeah. So for an ISTP, he's leading with a process of introverted thinking. We've called it accuracy. His Copilot would be extroverted sensing. We've nicknamed that sensation. And right behind sensation, at the 10-year-old position for an ISTP, in the tertiary or 10-year-old position, would be introverted intuition. And we've nicknamed that perspectives. Now, perspectives, when done well, is great about finding patterns of people's thought processes. It's about seeing how the mind forms patterns, understanding how minds form patterns. And when someone shows up with a strength, like let's say an INTJ or an INFJ, they really understand how to shift perspective and see things from another person's perspective, almost intuitively. Literally, they just shift perspective and can see how someone sees something. And this process also future paces. So it can be used to future pace. This is how he can anticipate what someone might do in a drug enforcement situation. Now, if he goes directly to that, let's say he's at home and he's speculating, well, I got to do this drug enforcement thing tomorrow. And he starts speculating using that NI process, that introverted intuition process, perspectives at his tertiary level. he doesn't really have anything to go from. Remember, he's a sensor. He's an ISTP. He shows up best when he's in his Copilot of sensation. Sensation's all about real-world feedback, about being in your body, about being present, kinesthetic, understanding what's happening in the moment. His tertiary process needs to have in the moment experience to be able to be used well. So for him to do this from a distance or in a boardroom somewhere or at the police station trying to guess things, it's not going to serve him very well. In fact, he might speculate wrongly about what could happen. But in the field, in the middle of a drug enforcement situation, he can size that person up using his sensation process. He can see what they look like. He can see their posture. He can see if they're carrying a weapon. He can see where the doors and exits are and how many other people are in the room that might be a potential threat. He's got a lot of real-world, real-time data to pull from. He's perceiving the world as it is in real time. Now his tertiary process can start to take the real-world data and start to speculate on different scenarios that might happen in that real world situation, making him a really good cop at anticipating what's going to happen or potentially what's going to happen so he can prepare for it and be ready to act at any moment.
Yeah, I think of something I read about Wayne Gretzky, who said that one of the reasons why he was so good at what he did is he didn't skate to the puck, he skated to where the puck was going. And I don't know Wayne Gretzky's personality type, but that sounds very ISP to me. It sounds like somebody who's using the information of the situation and then future pacing what is about to happen next. It's very tactical. One of the ways that loop can happen for ISPs when they get caught in that loop of going to their 10-year-old or tertiary process of introverted intuition is they can, because they're not really using any real-time feedback information to fuel what they're anticipating or projecting or future pacing, and they're trying to get inside other people's heads without anything to really go on. I think this is why sometimes the stereotype comes up of being sort of a conspiracy theorist, or maybe projecting bad intent, or thinking somebody's out to get them, or assuming like maybe their spouse is cheating on them. But when they have that in the moment information, they have something to go on. And so then they can determine whether or not their projection is, something that is just a fear manifesting, or whether or not like that makes sense. And there's there's a couple different simulations that are probably the most likely to happen. So I see that as one of the ways that perspectives or introverted intuition 10-year-old really shows up and serves an ISP as long as they're making sure to be in that Copilot first. So that's a great example of that relationship. As a final example, let's use something also that comes from our real world experience, our life. We have a very good friend who has a great, really special relationship with our daughter, Piper. She's been watching her since Piper was, just a few months old. She really loves our daughter, and she's been wonderful. She's helped us out, by watching our daughter when we've had events and when we've had to be out of town. She's just been really wonderful at watching Piper. And her personality type is ESFJ. Now, we discovered through some back channels, she hasn't told us this directly, but we have discovered that she thinks we're mad at her right now. And both of us are looking at each other like, why would she think we're mad at her? There's no reason for us to at all be mad at her. But we were gone for a while. We spent the winter in Florida. And so we were gone for a few months and she didn't hear from us. And we thought she knew we were out of town, but there was something about it that just, I guess, didn't feel right to her. Now, as an ESFJ, one of the ways that the loop can show up is that an ESFJ leads with a process called extraverted feeling and what we've nicknamed harmony. And their co-pilot or auxiliary process is introverted sensing, or what we call memory. And then their 10-year-old or tertiary process is extroverted intuition, and again, what we call exploration. Now, when they get caught in a loop, exploration generally is about pattern recognizing things and trying to figure out what's going on. It's almost like problem solving to some extent. You're seeing all these disparate pieces of information and you're trying to create a pattern with all these things and come to a conclusion about what could be happening. It's very similar to introverted intuition, only instead of future pacing, it's more like what's happening right now. What's the pattern I'm observing right this second? Now, the loop is frequently seen as forming a pattern or maybe speculating on something that you don't really have enough information to go on. In fact, not only do you not have enough information to go on, but the pattern might be based on bad information, or it might be based on something that you've never seen before. Now, in this particular situation, we actually have never been upset at this person. And this has happened a couple times where she's thought that maybe we're mad at her. And every single time we go, yeah, we're not mad at you. I'm not sure why you think we're mad at you. I'm not sure why you think this, but we never are mad. And so what she should be doing is going to the Copilot process of introverted sensing and saying, what is the precedent that was set here? What has my past experience told me? Are they the kind of people that get mad frequently, and have they been mad at me? And then were she to do that, she could go to her tertiary 10-year-old process of exploration and then try to form a pattern of speculation. Well, maybe they've just been out of town a lot, or maybe they're just super busy. Now, the speculation would be based on like what she knows about us. It would be based on her memory or experiences that we've had with her. So it would be a much better, far more accurate speculation. And it would also give us the benefit of the doubt. Now, I mean, obviously I'm using a personal example, and maybe this is just, it might sound like, hey, she needs to give us the benefit of the doubt. But in this situation, it would actually help her because she has fear around this. She's upset. She thinks that we're mad at her, and this is distressing to her. For her to be at her best self and really allow that 10-year-old or tertiary process to serve her and show up at, like basically an added tool, is that she could use her understanding of our precedents, which is what introverted sensing is very tied into. It's very tied into what you have experienced in the past, what you've seen, what is something that is the most likely outcome based on all of your experiences with this. And so if she was in a space where she could remember that we've literally never been mad at her ever, and then her speculation would be a lot more, it would be a tool that would allow her to find grace for herself as well. Because I think there's some sense of like she deserves to be somebody that people are mad at. I think there's a part of that going on too. So when an ESFJ shows up at their best self, then their 10-year-old or tertiary process helps create a speculation or projection that is far more accurate and serves the person themselves and the person that they're trying to figure out information around. It becomes a lot more, it becomes a lot more grace-giving. It becomes a lot more fun and gregarious. And I think that's another way that it can show up with an ESFJ. We're using a very specific example of like a relationship. But I think in general, ESFJs, once they feel safe, which is another thing that Copilot or auxiliary process of introverted sensing does, is it helps them find that space where they feel safe and settled. Now their extroverted intuition or exploration 10-year-old tertiary process can show up as like fun and gregarious and the life of the party because they're not feeling any sort of threat. They're not feeling down or threatened, or, they're not feeling a need to be defensive. They don't have to project ill intent on anyone, or they don't have to speculate the worst case scenario and it's all going to come crashing down because they're settled in a feeling of safety. And so now their 10-year-old can come out to play.
So we've talked a lot about the tertiary process in its healthy form today. This has been the topic of the podcast. And we want you to see this in terms of having a healthy relationship with your tertiary process. The tertiary, the 10-year-old process is a place where a lot of times intimacy can come out for you. Playfulness, it's a place, it has a 10-year-old embodiment in some ways. And if you are focused on your driver process, your Copilot auxiliary process, and you are safe there and you've been working on yourself, that tertiary can be such a wonderful support structure. And again, it's always the challenge of making sure you're not going there first. When you're moving from the attitude of your dominant function or your driver function, you want to go to that Copilot first and let that tertiary support you. And that's really key. And that's the thing that we continually harp on. And I think we've unpacked a little more nuance around how that looks in the support rather than just go to your Copilot. And I think some people got the message like you ignore your tertiary or ignore your 10-year-old. And that's not the case at all. It's part of you. It's a significant part of you. It's a conscious part of you. And it's an important part of you. And that's what we want to hit home today in this podcast particularly.
I'd be curious to know how people are seeing their 10-year-old or tertiary process support them, show up for them in a positive and healthy way.
Here's your homework assignment. Okay, first of all, you got to figure out what personality type you are. If you haven't done that yet, we do have a free test over at personalityhacker.com. You can get a starter kit. It's a premium package to get more information on your personality, but just taking the test will allow you to know what your personality is. And then on the website, you can find that car model we talked about, and you can find out where your positions are in the car model and understand that. So you'll understand what your Copilot and what your 10-year-old are. And then when you understand that, I'd like you to go on to personalityhacker.com directly below this podcast and leave us a comment, leave us feedback about how this is showing up for you. How have you gone to that 10-year-old process, that tertiary process in a defensive way? How have you seen that support your Copilot when you've actually been there? Because we all have been there at times in our lives. And where is the nuance here? Where have you seen things go well for you? Where are the struggles? What's it showing up for you like? We want you to take this on as a serious homework assignment. Let us know and be part of the community of other people that are doing the very same thing, focused on their personal growth by understanding themselves on such a profound level that they can grow and develop to their best self.
You can leave a comment under this podcast at personalityhacker.com. And I have a feeling we're going to get some comments about Yoko. I wonder if somebody's a big Yoko fan. I was like, that's not how it went down at all. It's not necessarily that Yoko did the Yoko. It's that's what was perceived to have happened and split up the Beatles. And that's why we use it as an archetype. So if you're a big Yoko fan, we get it. It's not necessarily that Yoko Yoko'd.
Yeah, exactly. If you'd like to join us over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, there's a growing community of like minds, people just like you, interested in personal growth using personality models and other frameworks in their lives.
You can also subscribe to us on iTunes if you enjoy what you're hearing, and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly giving, we request that you take a couple moments and find time to leave us a rating and review on iTunes, since that helps us out a lot.
My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.